Henry Newman, Open Europe think tank, also very experienced in government as an advisor. I think it would be fair to say that Open Europe has struck for a long time a sort of gently and intelligently sceptical position and has sought to interpret how to deliver on that vote in 2016.
That's right.
So same question goes to you, but with a different angle. What did you think was going to happen and where do you think we've ended up?
So I was in government at the time of the referendum and before, and I got to listen to Ivan's Eeyorish wisdom in private. I remember Luxembourg JHA councils and briefings from Ivan, and also reading all the details coming through at different points. So it's sort of one of the great things about Brexit, one of the ironies of Brexit is we're learning so much more, the public is learning so much more about Europe. I find it strange, I get on the tube in the morning and you listen to people chatting about the customs union, the withdrawal agreement bill, parliamentary process as well, and of course our politics have also becoming much more European, more Italian at the moment. But
I hope you noticed we've got an interview with Matteo Renzi today saying just that, which I'd love to recommend to you. It's a very funny line.
And I think overall we beat ourselves up absolutely massively about our political class, quite rightly, and it's important that we've got robust scepticism of our political leaders. But we shouldn't go too far. And I think if you look across the Western world, politics ain't pretty anywhere. And also, I've been talking through the course of my job in Open Europe, I get to meet many fascinating people. And it's amazing when you sort of think about how changes like joining the euro and how these processes were understood in Europe. One anecdote springs to mind very quickly. A European ambassador in London was discussing with a friend of mine this and said, well, of course, after the euro, we'd still be able to change our own interest rates. And this friend was sort of saying, no, you won't. But the point was just that I think it's easy to beat up on our politicians. And I scream at the television or at Twitter as much as probably anybody else when people say things that are just untrue. But I think this is a sort of a broader problem with politics. And it's a particular problem with political leadership because campaigns are obviously in poetry, but government is in prose. And after the referendum campaign, the government failed to come together and be honest about the actual trade-offs inherent in leaving the European Union. They weren't honest enough about how long it was going to take to leave the European Union, and they could have said very easily, look, the Leave campaign pretended it was all very simple. That isn't true. The Remain campaign pretended the EU had no influence over our lives. That isn't true either. This is going to take longer and be more complicated, and we need to have a national conversation. That should have happened. The Prime Minister should have reached across the aisle and worked with the opposition parties. She should have done that particularly after she lost her majority in 2017. But all of that is coulda, woulda, shoulda. And there's plenty of problems with the negotiation process overall. But I actually think one of the big secrets is how good a deal we actually got in this withdrawal agreement. And there are constitutional issues with the backstop. But I think you have to accept that Brexit throws an inherent problem for Northern Ireland that can only be resolved through a degree of hybridity. That's probably not the correct word, but a hybrid solution for Northern Ireland of some sort. For my taste, it puts the balance too far in the European court, but you've got to accept that some joint approach makes sense. Besides that, if you could actually look past a lot of the issues with the backstop and the public narrative shaped by the resignation of key ministers, which dominated the news, and I think the government's lamentable failure to communicate any of the benefits of the current deal, then you'd actually find that this deal is really quite good. And it's far from a blind Brexit or any of that. Actually, the withdrawal agreement guarantees a baseline that protects citizens' rights, that protects the trade in goods, not entirely frictionless, but pretty good. Certainly quota-free, tariff-free, rules of origin-free, all those things. Guarantees a no Irish border, and also guarantees the standstill transition that business wanted. I mean, if you approached from the beginning and thought, could you get something like that? Something that comes close to, except it doesn't quite, but comes close to dividing the four freedoms of the single market, that's basically where we got to. And I think that's about as much as you ever could have hoped for. Unfortunately, you've had absolutely inflated expectations on all sides, and that's sort of been lost in the melee of the political drama. And we all focus on the dramas and the votes and the kind of the Commons divisions and all this, and sort of lose sight of actually, I think, the broader picture. Very sort of quickly, I think, this whole panel session is premised obviously on the fact that we do leave, which is beginning to look more and more in doubt, I think, given dynamics at the moment. We also focus very much, of course, around the economic relationship. And I think that at the expense of discussing the sort of security aspects or the foreign policy aspects of leaving. And I think that's one of the kind of the trust and the relationships that are being challenged by Brexit pose a very profound problem to the whole continent of Europe, far beyond any actual deal that we get. And I think on both sides, there's a huge breakdown in trust and understanding. The UK doesn't understand Brussels, and European leaders repeatedly misunderstand the political process in the UK and have done for decades and decades. I also think there's a presentist problem that we assume that this whole problem began in 2016 or when David Cameron gave his Bloomberg speech a bit before. Fact is that Britain has been divided on this question from the beginning. The post-war British leaders chose not to join the project for different reasons. Harold Wilson's wife came back on the day of the 75 referendum and said, sorry, darling, I couldn't vote for it. And then every single government of any political colour has sought opt-outs and exemptions from every major treaty since Maastricht. This is a problem that has gone through our British politics and goes to the core of our identity and the sort of bifurcation between a European nation and a nation that looks to the open seas. So I don't think it's a new problem, but we kind of beat ourselves up about this as if it's something that arrived last week. And very quickly, I think one of the... Yeah, last point. If you step forward, overall, the balance, if assuming the UK does change, the balance on this continent between the EU and the non-EU will fundamentally shift. The EU will no longer be able to claim to represent the continent in the same way that it did previously. That has very interesting questions for the future of the 27 as well, which is something that we hardly ever pay any attention to. The breakdown in relations between France and Italy is fascinating, and this isn't just about Macron-Salvini rivalry. This is also because Italy has decided to back Germany on a permanent Security Council seat, overturning a 2 decades-long approach from the Italians and the French that there would not be German Security Council seat at the expense of Italy. So how does that balance play out overall? I personally can't think that assuming we do leave, within a decade or two, that there isn't a new architecture that is somehow created which incorporates Britain at some level of an outer tier of a European corporation or a Western corporation.
If we don't leave.
If we do leave. I think Britain has repeatedly tried to find different architectures within Europe, from the Western European Union that we all forget about back decades ago, and beyond, that incorporates Britain's difficult relationship with Europe, but also obvious profound integration economically and in terms of foreign policy. How does that shape out? We don't know, but I can't believe that we'll be in a position in 10 or 20 years' time where we don't have some sort of institutional relationship with Europe. But I do agree with Ivan that I can't see it being a formal customs union or a total single market membership, because I don't think that would be sustainable out of the short term.
Great. Thank you very much for all galloping.
Used by Ivan, and that's exactly right. I think the whole indicative vote process, I understand what the MPs want to find a compromise, but it is just self-indulgent. The deadline was today to agree the withdrawal agreement from the EU to lock in the longer extension. And there's all these calls in the public space to the Prime Minister to shift her red lines. That doesn't change anything on the divorce deal, the withdrawal agreement. So, as Catherine said, the divorce deal, the Article 50 process, deals with the past, the separation, other than big brackets, the backstop. That is the reality of it. I think as well, we beat up massively on our politicians, quite rightly, because both main parties promised to deliver Brexit and are running away from those commitments in different directions. But I also think the EU has some culpability here. The whole backstop was designed to prevent a hard border in the event of no deal. We're again risking with this possibility of no deal precisely because of an insurance policy to prevent a hard border, which they've now said wouldn't happen anyway, even in the event of no deal. So I just think it is this. I understand the.
Have they said that, or is that a debating point? Because there are different interpretations.
Well,
just flesh it out for anyone who managed to miss that bit.
We've had the Taoiseach say variously you could have a militarised hard border. We've had other people say that we wouldn't have any sort of border. So, look, I'm not minimising the problems for the Irish border in the event of no deal, and I completely accept that. But I just think that there is a particular irony that we are now unable to reach agreement because of an insurance policy to resolve the Irish border question, which is now therefore leading to a potential problem on the Irish border if we can't reach agreement. It's just a little bit crazy. But then that's perhaps Brexit overall. I think I was being slightly flippant earlier with will we leave, won't we leave? But I do think that if you force a choice for MPs between no deal and revocation, I think Parliament would break for revocation. I think that would be profoundly problematic, and we're already, there's some protests outside today, but I think I'm genuinely very, very worried about which way all this is going to go. I can't see how a second referendum would actually deal with any of the divisions in the country. These divisions are going to be there. A general election looks more and more likely, but I think part of the problem is the main parties are not thinking strategically. Neither is the DUP. I understand the DUP's concerns, but triggering a general election or forcing a position where a general election could happen could lead to one of two outcomes, most likely. Either a Corbyn majority government, which is problematic for the DUP for very obvious reasons, or a Conservative majority government, which would probably find that the easiest way to resolve the whole question of leaving and the backstop would be to revert to a Northern Ireland-only backstop and have Canada for Great Britain. So I think that, irrespective of the fact that going back to the people would be something that I think most of the public would find completely baffling. The public want a decision made. They've got many different views about how that decision should be made, whether through a referendum, whether through a hard Brexit, whether through a deal or whatever else. But I think that actually what the public do agree on is they want a decision made.
Well, they do, but that has turned out not to get us very far. The only thing that we haven't discussed, I think, in this...
In a radically different fashion.
So I think that I completely agree. I think my problem as well with the confirmatory referendum is I don't believe the facts have actually got clearer in the minds of a lot of the public. Every time you turn on the television, you've got different politicians on all sides making arguments that are just untrue. And I think the divisions have got worse and worse. I think that you might imagine a result slightly differently in potentially on a different franchise with a different turnout. And I don't think that would lead to a stable membership for the UK and would cause profound problems for Europe as well if the UK had narrowly voted to remain and then spent 5 to 10 years arguing amongst itself about whether we should have another referendum and behaving like a sort of supercharged Hungary or Poland in the European Council. Also, one of the arguments made by opponents of the current withdrawal agreement is that it's a blind Brexit. And we don't know the future, but then they want to confirm the future, supposedly, with a referendum, which I find confusing. I think, how does the government get out of this?
Sorry, why is that paradox? Because you would...
So
the idea of a referendum would be...
Well, we don't know the future, we only know the divorce. So so I think until
we
we
have to put the future...
So I think, and look, all of this is a bizarre argument. Any future government could rejoin the EU, any future government could join the single market, any future government could, by negotiation, form a customs union with the EU. All of those things are possible once we've left, by negotiation. And I think if I was advising the government, she's got to accept that Parliament is so divided that one of the only ways may be to kick the can down the road in a very explicit way, to change the political declaration to offer an explicit menu of options. The current deal leading to Canada, the current deal leading to customs union by negotiation, the current deal leading to common market 2.0. Whether those are unicorns or not doesn't matter. You punt it into the future and make a commitment, which is already, by the way, a matter of fact, that you'll have a general election before the next treaty is ratified. And that way, you just move this on and we can discuss all of this once we're divorced.
Once we're divorced, yeah.
There's been plans for quite a while to have an emergency David Lidington prime ministership, but I think that was more in the case of if the prime minister simply couldn't go on for a different reason. I think government of national unity is very unlikely. I think simply because there's a lot of divisions within the Commons, it's just not how our system works. My European friends keep saying, why can't you just do a grand coalition? But it doesn't work in that way, obviously, here for reasons that we know. I think, again, there's the unreality of this entire debate. The Labour Party's position is to seek a customs union when there already is a customs union in the deal until you can resolve essentially frictionless trade and the Irish border question. So, on what basis does adding a customs union really change a lot of this? And I think if you did add a customs union, it would be a customs union that involved harmonisation on state aid probably, and would not give you the sort of say over trade deals that the Labour Party want, and therefore the Labour Party may very well turn around and say, well, sorry, that's still not the customs union we want, and we don't really get that much further. I go back to the point I made a minute ago. I think adding explicit options into the political declaration as a menu would be a better approach. My understanding was in the autumn of last year, that was what was actually planning to happen, and then it didn't happen in the political declaration. There was a sort of strange period where the withdrawal agreement was published, and then there was a very thin political declaration, and then it suddenly got bigger, and that all sort of seemed to happen over a few days, which was really quite odd. But the original plan was a menu of options. That would have been a much better approach. We could go back to that now and then promise a general election, the other side of it, once we're out. And then just on the narrow question of the 13th of April, it's obviously the legal default. I think Parliament will try to step in and will require the Prime Minister to accept whatever conditions are offered by the European Council meeting on the 10th of April. It's not impossible that the French absolutely refuse to offer an extension. I get some of that from my Elysée contacts, but I think it's unlikely that they would want to be blamed for a no-deal Brexit when dealing with European elections, including in the Pas-de-Calais. It just seems like a rather unlikely scenario. Much more likely we get a humiliating long extension on very, very poor terms and go into all kinds of mess. But if we did get to a no-deal, I think the economics and the border are the least of the problems. I think it would mean a profound breakdown in relations on this continent. I don't necessarily think Britain would crawl back to the table in the way that some people imagine on the continent. I think you'd have a radicalisation of the Conservative Party and have it led by somebody who, of a serious populist nature potentially, and all politics and all relations could spiral out of control, and defence cooperation and security cooperation on this continent would be profoundly at risk.
Can I just say that on the...
Henry, because we're running
I
to
think
the end of our time.
On revocation, my view, as I said previously, was if Parliament's forced into a choice, revocation or no deal, they'll choose revocation. On the tutorials, yes, I agree. I mean, I'm speaking to very informed backbench MP who told me the great thing about the Customs Union Amendment from Ken Clarke is it would solve the need for a backstop. So, no, it wouldn't. And of course, this is confounded by an opposition who, for understandable political reasons, want to present their policy as a solution to all problems. I also got told, I was on an interview with Jenny Chapman, where she said the great thing about a customs union was give us access on services, which is also, yeah. So I agree, but I think this is not a specific problem to Brexit. I've worked in and around politics for a while, and MPs are obviously forced to vote on all kinds of things that they have very little time to digest, and they normally let MPs and the whips make decisions on their behalf, and that's how our system works. It doesn't work when MPs feel the need to go against the whip and this becomes some sort of national debate question. It's unhealthy. I also agree with what Ivan was saying. If we can get to a situation where Katja Adler and Mark Stone aren't doing repeated live interviews from Brussels every single evening all the time, then actually we might be able to find a way through and a solution. But can we get there? On the People's Vote second referendum campaign, I genuinely don't understand how this actually will make any of the problems any better. I accept in good faith that many people feel very, very passionately about that, and many of my friends feel the same way. It's a perfectly reasonable position. But the problem is that we don't know what our future relationship's going to be. And as you were suggesting, sir, if Parliament pointed towards a customs union on top of the current deal, and then we put a choice of the customs union or remain, I think many of the country would feel disenfranchised by that choice, which they wouldn't see us presenting a Brexit choice alongside a remain choice. Now, whether that's right or wrong, that's just a reality of where the country is at the moment.